Hello, everyone, and welcome to AP US History for Winners with your teacher, Mr. Johnson. Last time we talked about and wrapped up Unit 3 with the developing an American identity and movement in the early Republic notes, and today we are beginning Unit 4 talking about the rise of political parties in the era of Jefferson. This unit is going to take us from about 1800 to about 1840. So, if you are ready, let's begin. First thing we want to talk about is early 1800s political parties. Now, these are some topics we talked about in our previous unit, but we got to refresh, okay? So, just so we know where we're at in terms of politics, the very first president, who is it? George Washington. Remember, he did not have a party. He runs pretty much uncontested for both of his terms, and he's kind of a Federalist, but he would say he didn't have a party. Second president, John Adams, Federalist for sure. Third president, Thomas Jefferson, and he's a Democratic Republican. Now, what's important to know about how we switched from John Adams, a Federalist, to Thomas Jefferson, a Democratic Republican, is that this shows that there can be a peaceful transition of power between the political parties, between Federalists and Democratic Republicans. Okay, so I just wanted to give you that so you had a little bit of context. So, in terms of the early political parties, we're going to get debates over the size and the role of the federal government and how strictly the Constitution should be followed. And these are debates that we've already kind of brought up. It's the same topic, and they're going to still continue to figure out these questions. And they're going to debate specifically a couple of issues. One of them is called tariffs. Now, if you don't know what a tariff is a tax on imported goods. So it would be like if I was going to buy a shirt made in England, those shirts, when they come to America, are going to have a tax on them, so they are more expensive. So this is going to increase the price of goods, and the idea is that it makes people want to buy stuff made in America more because there's less taxes on it. Okay, so with understanding tariffs, the Federalists are going to favor tariffs because they are often thought of as favoring industry. Okay, and American industry wants people to buy their products. They don't want people to buy international products. So Federalists are going to favor tariffs, and the Democratic Republicans, the Jeffersonians, are going to oppose them because the Jeffersonians are usually thought of as a party for farmers, and the farmers, takes a lot of money and they earn a lot of debt to produce food on their farm, and so they usually just want the cheapest goods possible. The other big idea that they're debating, as always, is the power of the federal government. Now, in general, and there's going to be some exceptions, but in general, the Federalists want more power for the central government, and the Democratic Republicans want states' rights and less power for the central government. There is going to be a little contradiction here when the Democratic Republicans want to have this thing called the Louisiana Purchase we'll get into, and the Federalists are against it, which is a little bit of a contradiction of this idea, but this is in general what these two sides want. So the other thing that we need to talk about that's we haven't mentioned yet is the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court is the group of justices as part of the judicial branch at the top of the judicial branch, and the decisions that they make are about issues in the country, and their decisions essentially become the law of the land. And we need to look at a few very, very important Supreme Court cases at this time period to understand what they have to say. Now, the first one is called Marbury versus Madison. Now, anytime in this class, if you see a name versus a name, that means it's a Supreme Court case. So, Marbury versus Madison is probably the most important Supreme Court case ever because it essentially says what the Supreme Court can do. Okay, so the language here is it establishes the primacy or the importance of the judiciary. So Marbury versus Madison declares that the Supreme Court gets to decide if laws are constitutional or not. So without the Supreme Court case, I'm not really sure what the Supreme Court does. So this says that the Supreme Court gets to decide what laws are constitutional or not. Okay, once they have that decision, and once the Supreme Court kind of settles into what they need to do, in general, they are going to assert that federal laws take precedence over state laws, meaning federal laws are more important than state laws. A couple of examples, again, very important. Gibbons versus Ogden. This Supreme Court case states that Congress, national Congress, federal Congress, right, has sole control over interstate trade. Now, interstate trade means that this is trade between two or more states, like if Connecticut was trading with Massachusetts. These states don't have control over how to tax that or how that's going to look. The federal government does, okay? Intra-state trade would be a trade between its own state, like Hartford trading with New Haven. Now the states get to control that, not the federal government. But Gibbons versus Ogden says that Congress controls interstate trade. Last very important Supreme Court case for today is McCullough versus Maryland. And this basically declares that the Bank of the United States, the bus, is constitutional and that the states cannot tax the federal government. So this says that the federal government, again, has more power than the states. And if the federal government says that something's going to happen, the states in general need to follow along. You're going to need to memorize those three, especially Marbury versus Madison. So, put those in your brain. The last big idea that we need to talk about today is a huge land grab that takes place in 1803. So it's called the Louisiana Purchase. And as you see on the map on the right, this is how America gets almost half of its territory, maybe a third of its territory. Okay. So at this time, the U.S. wants to expand its influence. They want to get more control over North America. They want to keep pushing west. As we've kind of seen all throughout this course, America wants to push west. Now, Thomas Jefferson is going to be the architect when he's president of this plan, and he wants to purchase New Orleans from the French. New Orleans is just that city, right, near the Gulf of Mexico and in the south part of America, okay? And he just wants to purchase New Orleans because, remember, if we're thinking about the Mississippi River, that's a big trading port, gives us access to the Gulf of Mexico and Atlantic Ocean for a lot of those inland states. Now, at this time in France, Napoleon is fighting wars all over Europe, okay? And he needs money for his armies, okay? Napoleon was the leader of France at the time. And he says, what about this, Thomas Jefferson? I won't just sell you New Orleans. What if I sell you all of Louisiana? Now, at this time, Louisiana is what's outlined in that map, okay? What if I sell you all of Louisiana for just $15 million? Whoa, that's crazy. Okay, so at the time, this doubles the size of the United States. And Jefferson has no, in his mind, he has no choice but to take Napoleon up on this idea. It's a great deal, and we purchase it. Now, here's the issue. The Constitution has no language in it that says the president gets to buy land from a foreign power, that the president can do this by himself. And so even though Jefferson is a Democratic Republican and he's supposed to be someone who says state rights and the federal government shouldn't have all the power, in this instance, he switches his mind. He goes from a strict interpretation of the Constitution to a loose interpretation of the Constitution. So someone who's strict constitutionalist means they only follow the Constitution exactly what it says. Someone who's loose kind of decides that, there's a little bit of power in there that maybe is not explicitly said in the Constitution. So for this decision, Jefferson switches his mind. And so this is a big, important example of how people in political parties, might have ideas that they state they believe in, but at the end of the day, if there's something that they believe is going to be best for the country, they might go against those supposed ideals. Okay, that's it for today's notes on the rise of political parties in the era of Jefferson. But as always, we need to think about some big ideas to try to synthesize our information. Big idea one, what issues were political parties debating in the early 1800s, and how did the two sides kind of decide on those issues? Two, what was the governmental concern with the Louisiana Purchase? What were people worried about? And three, we got to know these Supreme Court cases back of our hands. What's the decision? Marbury versus Madison, Gibbons versus Ogden, and McCullough versus Maryland. So that is it. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.